Thank you guys so much for joining in. We have the lovely head of conversation design outreach at Google today, Cathy Pearl. We're so excited to hear all of the new announcements that you have and to hear about the evolution that you've seen on the conversation design role so far. So welcome for everybody who hasn't sat on one of these webinar series before. These are hosted by Voiceflow. Our goal is to make it easy for anyone to design, prototype, and build voice apps, no matter where you are and no matter how large your team is. And we make it easy for teams to collaborate in real time, to leave feedback, to build together, and ideally create a one-stop shop to centralize all of your voice experiences. And are ultimately working with communities like this to democratize conversation design and development for just about anyone. And in this series, we're trying to tackle a bunch of different things, from interviewing thought leaders to highlighting creators and their stories, to connecting business minds and futurists, and also ultimately growing with this lovely community of voice enthusiasts. We want to make sure that right now we're able to level up all of the connections that you guys have to make the space even bigger and even more powerful as we continue to grow. So let's get started. I'm today's host. My name is Emily. If you haven't met me, I'm the head of growth at Voiceflow. And I am super excited to quickly introduce our featured guest today, Cathy Pearl. Would you like to give us a quick little spiel? Who are you?
Who am I? It's a deep question. I am a conversation designer who has been working on speech recognition technology for about 20 years in different formats, from phone systems to apps, and now at Google on the Google Assistant. It's been a really interesting journey to see where the technology has gone, and I'll get into that with a few slides. But yeah, I'm sorry we couldn't all be here together in person, but excited that we can still do this kind of thing virtually. So thanks a lot for having me on.
Awesome, thanks so much. So as we get started, Cathy's actually going to kick things off with a lightning talk. So if you can go ahead and share your screen.
Perfect, excellent. So I will just kick off. I've only got like 4 slides, so this is pretty short. But in the theme that Emily was talking about, where it's like what has changed for conversation designers, of course, you got to go back to the mid-90s when speech recognition first became mainstream on automated phone systems. I used to work for a company called Nuance that builds IVRs and these kind of things. And it was kind of the first chance for regular people to experience speech recognition. And I want to tell one story about that time, which some of you may have heard me talk about before. But Nuance was one of the first companies to make IVRs or speech IVRs. And the first client they launched was the financial company Charles Schwab. And you could call up the system, and the only thing you could do was get stock quotes. That's it. You could say IBM or AT&T or whatever and get a quote. And the interesting thing I think is interesting is they knew this would obviously save money, because before you had to call a human to get a stock quote. People weren't really on the internet yet and things like that. But the thing that they found is that the heaviest, highest trading sort of people getting stock quotes used to call their broker at Schwab maybe once or twice a day. But when they were able to call the automated phone system, they called it dozens of times a day, because it wasn't that they couldn't have done that. Technically, they could have called their broker as many times as they wanted, but they didn't, because it was like, I'm bothering somebody. It's a human. When they could make it a call to the computer, they didn't feel that anymore. It was kind of an unexpected side effect to the technology they hadn't really realized. Fast forward to the present, obviously things have changed in a lot of ways. Some things haven't changed, but speech recognition has had massive improvements, of course. We no longer need to handwrite every single grammar. I used to be writing and please in my yes/no grammars. It was a very manual process. That being said, natural language understanding still requires a lot of manual labor. It's not all automated by any means. And of course, the other great innovation are the far field microphones. When people talk on the phone, you've got a unidirectional mic, who is speaking. It's a lot easier to do that speech processing. When it's just, there's a bunch of people in the room, it's like, is that someone talking? Are they talking to me? It adds a whole layer of complexity. And I'm still astonished, honestly, when I can talk and have my smart speaker actually hear me. In terms of conversation design. Now, when I started, there was no such title as conversation designer. That's a pretty new thing. We used to call ourselves VUI, voice user interface designers, because it was all voice back then. Now, over time, it's evolved to the term conversation designer because now you might be designing for voice and text. And all these different things are part of conversation design, and so it's kind of evolved. But in terms of responsibilities, when I worked at Nuance, we wore a lot of hats as VUI designers. I would meet with clients and get requirements. I would write prompts, flows, 300-page dialogue design specifications. I would do usability testing. I would do traversal testing. I would handwrite grammars, even do some tuning where we got data back and would tweak all the parameters in the recognition engine. Now that's changed a lot for most folks. If you're at a small startup, sometimes you are wearing a lot of those hats still, but at a bigger company like Google, it's much more specialized. People are often either just doing design, or they're just working on natural language, or they're just working on TTS. But people, a good conversation designer should really still try and understand the technology. How does the actual speech recognition work? It's still really important to have that knowledge in the back of your mind when you're designing. And also, as in this picture of this, here's this guy, he's chopping away and he's using his smart display, which we call voice forward, a voice forward device. Meaning everything, even though it has a screen, you should be able to do everything with that device, hands-free. So now a conversation designer doesn't have to just do voice only. They've also got to be able to do multimodal, voice only, voice forward, intermodal like the mobile phone, even like the car or the watch. So there's sort of broader skill set that is required. In terms of some stuff that's going on lately, obviously when COVID first started happening, we really had to scramble because people were really hungry for information, and we had to really ramp up our turnaround time to be able to add new information. And we added some things like you can ask for, what's the latest coronavirus news, and get updates and things like that. We also built some things like, hey, G, help me wash my hands, to help kids and adults kind of, know how long 20 seconds or 40 seconds are when you're washing your hands. So we've been trying to react and get ahead of all those types of queries that are coming at us, fast and furious. Finally, the last thing I just want to mention is what I'm kind of feeling very passionate about these days, which is feeling like voice technology is finally maturing enough to really help people who need it the most. For example, last year, Google launched Project Euphonia. So speech recognition has improved a lot, but it still doesn't work for everybody. And particularly maybe some people who may have things like ALS, or they've had a stroke, and their voice is hard for speech recognition engines to understand. Project Euphonia seeks to fix that and build those models that can help people kind of, who would benefit the most by being able to use their voice to do things. And then lastly, there's another app we released last year called Live Transcribe, which does, as you might think, as you speak, it shows what you're saying on the screen, which is a great tool for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. So I'm really excited to see those types of things develop. And that's all I have.
Okay, awesome. So you kind of mentioned this, and you started your career a while back, originally in IVR. And I think you touched a little bit already on VUI designer, but as of right now, do you consider yourself more on the conversation designer side? Do you still see elements of that VUI, or how has that changed over the years?
I definitely go by conversation designer now. And again, I think that's because although certainly a large portion of my job is still voice and voice only devices, I really want for people to understand that if you're building, for example, for something like the Google Assistant, which is a complex ecosystem that has all these different surfaces, a conversation designer should not constrain themselves to the voice only experience, which should be thinking more broadly about what is this conversation like when it's on a smart display? What is it like when I'm on my phone, when somebody might switch between speaking and then they're tapping and then they're typing? And to me, all those things are part of the conversation you're having with the Google Assistant. So a conversation designer will want to have that different, broader skill set. There are certainly folks out there who are doing voice only. For example, if you're working on phone systems, and I think, you call yourself a conversation designer or a voice designer, whatever you're more comfortable with. But I think conversation designer encompasses more of the broader things people do now.
Awesome. I think we've definitely seen a huge trend in more and more people adopting these types of titles. I know your LinkedIn's probably flooded with people who've been updating and getting more of these job positions, but it's really exciting to kind of see where that's going. Next up, in terms of the conversation design workflow, this is something that's kind of continued to evolve and starting to structurize across different teams right now. What's the first step that you would suggest in a conversation design workflow?
So if anyone has seen me give a talk before, you'll probably know the words that are going to come out of my mouth next, which are sample dialogues, which are really one of the key components in a conversation designer's toolkit. And for anyone out there who might not be familiar with sample dialogues, you can think of it like a movie script. It's potential pathways through your conversational system. And you just write it down. You write, what might the user say, what might the computer say, what might the user say, whether you're doing a voice or a text, either way. And each one of these individual sample dialogues, I get this question a lot, is just one possible pathway. You're not thinking about like, oh, they could say these 10 things here or whatever. It's just one path at a time. But the great thing about sample dialogues are it's really low fidelity. It's very easy for people to understand, like getting stakeholders involved if you're just throwing around use cases. And what we recommend is once you've written a sample dialogue, even if it's for a text bot, read it out loud, and especially read it out loud where somebody playing the user is not someone who wrote it or is familiar with it. And you'll be shocked at how many things right out of the gate you find problems with, like, oh my gosh, I didn't think someone would say that. We can't handle that. Or, oh, this is something that's interesting. We can add to that. So absolutely recommend to write sample dialogues. Anyone can do it. You don't have to be a great writer. It's just a great way to get your ideas out there and start finding the good and the bad parts.
Yeah, I think a comparison that we always make internally is always when we're writing out dialogue, sometimes there's a difference in between writing to sound smart versus writing to actually be heard. And I don't know if you've ever like read out loud an essay that you spent way too much time editing versus actually a text message, but that's always the early stages or piece of advice that we've always been given. In terms of the roles of trying to build out now how teams are being structured at these companies, what are kind of the ideal SWAT team roles that you think of when forming a voice team?
I think if you're lucky enough to have multiple conversation designers on your team, which I know a lot of companies are lucky if they even get one, but if I got to have a team of people, it's great to have someone who definitely has a technical bent where they really get the speech recognition portion of it. They understand the basics of ASR and NLU, and can really utilize that to remind the team of like, oh, this won't work because of this issue or things like that. So it's great to have somebody who's an expert there. It's great to have somebody who's just a really good writer. Like in my job, I can write decent prompts, but sometimes, when I want them to be better, I'll go to a colleague. Like some of you may know my colleague, James Jangola, who co-wrote one of the first voice user interface design books. And I'll go to James and I'll be like, make it better. And he'll just turn out these beautiful, beautiful prompts. So some people just really have a real skill for that. And it's great to have somebody on your team like that. And then somebody who is skilled in multimodal design is great. Somebody maybe who has a little bit of a visual design background who can really help with those conversational elements. But I think the thing I'd say is most important is for a team to have the ability to communicate well, even when they disagree, and to feel safe doing so, and also the ability to compromise. I think a lot of times as designers, we are artists and we say, this is my beautiful design and it must be so, or it will be terrible. But rarely does your design get built just the way you wanted it. It's very rare. And so it's really nice to be able to say, okay, I can compromise. Sometimes I'll get what I want. Sometimes I have to, do it another way. I think you'll be happier that way and more successful.
Awesome. I think thinking about roles and thinking about kind of what makes a team or someone in conversation design successful, there's the people, but there's also the tools and the technologies that they need to be made aware of. So kind of thinking through what are some of the core technologies that conversation designers need to get familiar with. What are some that are kind of top of mind?
I think one again goes back to understanding speech recognition. I find sometimes I'll talk to people who come out of like a text chatbot world and they're very used to designing for text only. And I think some people have this idea that speech recognition is a solved problem, like, oh, it's like 95% accurate, we're good to go. And don't realize that we still actually have a lot of issues. Like people may not know that short utterances like yes and no are actually still pretty hard to handle sometimes. Or if you're building something where you need to collect an email address, it's pretty easy for most people to type out an email address, but boy, is that hard for a speech recognition system. Even names like my name, Cathy, is it with a C or a K? How's it going to know? And also, I think people are used to looking at transcriptions to see, well, how's my system doing? But transcriptions really just aren't always accurate, and sometimes you miss issues because you can't hear what was actually said. So again, I just think having that knowledge that speech recognition actually doesn't always work. Things like a voice assistant, you may say something, but it may not hear you speak. So if you write a prompt that says, oh, you should say something now, it's like infuriating to the user because it's like, I did say something, you just didn't hear me. And so just having that knowledge can really benefit your design.
Awesome. So, as and you kind of touched on this very lightly with multimodal, but as we're seeing more and more of a popularization in, let's say, like the Google Nest Hub, the Alexa Echo, all of these visual pairings with voice, how do you suggest that conversation designers start to adapt for voice first or voice forward experiences?
One of the things we recommend most is if you're designing an ecosystem like Assistant or Alexa, where you've got different services, we say start with the voice first. Make your conversational experience work really well and not surface. And the reason is that it may be surprising, but sometimes the voice only is the most complex or the most constrained. And once you've figured out a lot of those details, you can move on. And then you go to something like the Smart Display, and you have to ask yourself, where are visuals going to enhance the conversation? Because a lot of times people who are working on the screen-based device, they come from a visual background. And so they say, I have a screen. Obviously, I have to do something with the screen. I got to fill it up. I got to make it look nice. But sometimes that can be overwhelming or unnecessary or distracting. So you need to think about, like, we've already got a conversation built. Where is it going to be that a visual will actually make it better, as opposed to, oh, we have to fill the screen up with something. So really thinking about that, I think, is crucial.
Awesome. And I think this is kind of, well, for me personally, it was one of the very first things that I found out about you. But you literally wrote the book on GUI designers, and this is obviously plug. You need to check it out. But since you wrote it, are there any revisions or anything that you've learned since that you would like to make for the book?
Gosh, yeah, I definitely get asked sometimes, like, oh, when are you going to make the second edition? And I kind of have this, like, start kind of shaking and sweating, like a flashback to writing the first book. But actually, this came up recently on Twitter. Somebody had posted something. We were talking about what does conversational mean, and then they pointed out that in my book I had mentioned sort of a contrast between command and control, conversational, and I realized that I've kind of shifted my thinking a bit since then. In that, I actually think now that command and control, I'm going to bucket that under conversational system. It's a subset of some. And this is a very philosophical debate that many people would be on both sides of. But if you think about, like, if I ask somebody, hey, can you close the blinds? And they close the blinds and they don't say anything. Did we just have a conversation? Some people say yes. I say yes. Some people say no. That's not a conversation. That's like a, one-way command. But I bucket those into part of human conversations, and therefore I would say that command and control in computers are also. Anyway, so that's just one example where somebody pointed out something where I think my thinking has shifted. I'm sure there are other places in the book where in the last few years things have evolved a bit. So yeah, there's definitely things I would change, but I'm sort of afraid to even even start down that path.
Are there any resources that you would recommend outside of your own book, or any places that you go to learn more about the space?
For sure, and hopefully we can share some of these links. But
Absolutely.
there's a few places, like on Twitter. I recently posted a couple links of articles that I saw recently. One was a summary of conversation design courses that are available right now. There used to be kind of no formal courses you could take, but now there's multiple ones where you can sign up and learn online, and even sometimes get a certification. Another link I posted was about podcasts. There's tons of great podcasts out there about voice that you can learn from. Lots of great videos. On my website, cathypearl.com, I have an FAQ section where I also link to some other books that are interesting. Some books that aren't just about, say, voice design, but are about human conversation, like Talk, The Science of Conversation by Elizabeth Stocko, and How We Talk. These are some great books that just help you understand how humans talk, which really I think is beneficial to when we design for computers. And I also have a link to an article I wrote called How to Become a Conversation Designer, which again has some links and ideas for people who are looking to get started or looking for more resources. But the main thing I say to people is the best way to learn is to try, and to make a plug for Voiceflow, to use a tool like Voiceflow that lets you just experiment. You don't have to be able to code to get something up and running. You can put it out there. You can get feedback. You will learn so much so fast. And I think that's the absolute best way to get started.
Like 100% agree, not just because you plug Voiceflow, but just in general. I know myself and our team greatly started to learn and really expedite how we think about the product by diving in, by building, by making it accessible for anybody. So absolutely love that answer. And this kind of, you've like literally have an article for this, which I will definitely plug for this after. But let's say if you were to look back on Cathy 20 years ago, starting out, let's say today, what would you do now? What piece of advice would you give yourself as someone entering in the space right now?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. One thing that you're making me think of is like when I worked on automated phone systems. It was a lot of fun and really interesting. I'd always loved the idea of talking to a computer, so I love that aspect. But what we were building was often not what real people necessarily wanted. Calling an IVR and having to say operator 6 times, really not a fun experience for anyone. And I kind of got turned off of the whole technology for a while. In the early mid 2000s, I was like, I'm done with this. Speech recognition isn't really helping people. It's just helping businesses save money, and I tried to turn my career into something else, but I got sucked back in. And now I feel like we have so many other opportunities to use voice technology for lots and lots and lots of different things. Phone systems are still useful. They're still out there. But now, the smart speakers and things like that. And then, like I mentioned, having things like live transcribe and tools to help people who maybe have mobility issues or they're visually impaired. And so I think what's great about starting nowadays is that you've got this whole world of things out there that you can do with speech recognition and natural language. And it's just I think, an awesome time to start this as a career, because a lot of companies are realizing they need this. They might not know they need a conversation designer, and maybe you can help them understand that that's what they need. But it's a great time to get started in this.
I think that the interest around it, that coupled with just how much noise is in the space right now, it's such an exciting time. And I know me personally, I'm so excited for it to be adopted even at the education level, where more and more people are learning about it faster before they get into their early careers. I know that would have been something awesome, at least when I was back in school. And this is kind of, it's a meaty question because it's covering a lot in a tiny, a tiny slide. But what are some of the key milestones that you've seen, some transitionary wins or periods in voice over the last 20 years? And kind of to follow up on that, what do you think's next? What are we sitting on right now?
Some of the key milestones in my mind are, when speech recognition was first being created back in like the 1950s, it was speaker dependent. So you would train it for one person at a time. And even for many years, things like Dragon Dictate, Dragon Natural Speaking, still really benefited from personal training to recognize your voice. And so the move away from speaker dependent to speaker independent, which is what allowed speech recognition to be used on phone systems and things like that for the first time. So that was a huge milestone way back then. Then we moved into, in the early 2000s, statistical language modeling, which meant that, again, we didn't have to handcraft every possible expected utterance from callers, but could rely on more grouping and clustering of data. Then obviously the improved recognition models, so we can just get back a chunk of what someone said and do things like keyword spotting or phrase spotting, which makes things much, much easier. And then, of course, as we already talked about a little bit before, the far field microphone arrays, which totally a game changer, because now you don't have to be like right in front of whatever you're talking to with a unidirectional mic and only one speaker. You can have a lot going on. So I think those are some of the major milestones. What's next? I mean, who knows? I think one thing that's certainly down the line, and there's prototypes out there right now, are the idea of subvocalization, where you can speak to a voice assistant without anyone else hearing you. Because right now, that's something, even for me, when I'm out in public, I don't necessarily want to pull up my phone and talk to it because I don't want everyone hearing what I'm saying. There are things like at MIT, there's an experiment you can look up called Alter Ego, where they demonstrate a prototype of this. But I think that'll be a game changer, because I know it's probably because I'm kind of old school, but I'm not like a super fast typist on my phone. And there's a lot of times when I'd rather speak, but I don't. And I feel kind of encumbered by my phone because I can't communicate as fast as I want. But if I could do it with subvocalization, which, by the way, sometimes you'll see headlines that say, oh, we're reading your mind now with these like things. And it's like, no. You are starting to form the words. It's just you're stopping right before the sounds actually come out of your mouth. So it's picking up on bone conduction and other micro signals that figure out what you're actually about to say, and translating that to your device. So I think that'll be a big one.
That's super cool. I absolutely can't even imagine what that would unlock for so many things. I know that there's a ton of work and a ton of guesses in terms of all the ways that voice can continue to improve. And I hope that, especially given how much light we've gotten in the voice space over the last few years alone, that it will only get expedited. I'm personally excited for being able to access these things not so awkwardly outside. So at least when we all return. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. When we're all in the office, if we're all in the office talking to our computer, that'll be so annoying, right? But if you don't have to hear people, then it'll be cool.
Oh, I totally agree. And same with the typing. I'm a fast typer, but I like to think that I come across more naturally when I'm speaking. And now I've gotten into this habit of recording myself whenever I'm trying to write an email or trying to write something, and then typing it afterwards as
interesting
process, just because I find like it comes across better now. Maybe that's because I spend too much time talking to my various my various devices in my room right now. But at least that's a trend that I've started to see even amongst other friends that I know in the space. Cool. Anyways, we have so many questions from the community, so I want to make sure that we get through as many as we possibly can. One of the questions, and we'll go through this in no particular order, so bear with us as we go through these. But the first one that we see here is, what are recruiters looking for in conversation design portfolios, especially for new grads? And I'm also really curious, what does a conversation design portfolio even look like? And how do you prepare one of those?
That is a really good question. First, of course, I'll say, I can't speak for all companies or recruiters, but for myself, what I would look for in a portfolio, what I do look for is, obviously, of course, a portfolio should represent some of the work you've done. And as far as how do you represent that, especially if it's like a voice-only experience, there's some different ways, but I like to see process. I like to see like, we had this idea, or I had this idea, and here's my first thoughts about it. Like, here's a sample dialogue or a flow or something like that. And then I realized that's not going to work, and here's my revised flow. I love to see when people have insight, or like, oh, here's an aha moment I had during my design process, because nobody designs things perfectly from scratch. So when I see like a perfectly polished, finished mock or experience on a portfolio. I'm like, yeah, but how did you get here? In terms of how do you represent this kind of stuff, there's some different ways. One thing you can do, like if you're demonstrating something like an assistant action, is you could just record a video of yourself talking to it, or just audio. So you could have a recording of an interaction. And again, showing things like sample dialogues or flows or other artifacts of your project are also really useful. Another thing I advise people often is there's always a range of, some people don't have a lot of experience. Some people have built like 50 things. I like people to highlight fewer things than more things and go deeper into a few things, like go deep into one thing you've designed. And again, any aha moments you had or pivots you took. I find that really helpful because it feels like I get to know your problem solving a little bit more. If I have to go to a portfolio and look at 15 different things to get a feel for what you do, it's going to be too challenging. Just remember, people who look at your portfolios probably don't have a ton of time. And so you want to pack a lot into things. So you might pick like 3 projects, if you can, that are different and expose different areas of your expertise, and highlight those. I also get asked a lot like, well, I can't get a job because I don't have any experience, and I can't get any experience because I can't get a job. So in those cases, again, you can still build a portfolio with your sample projects. Again, like if you use Voiceflow or something and you make a prototype, you can use that in your portfolio. You don't have to use just stuff that was launched or whatever. So that's a great way to get started, even if you haven't yet had the job as a conversation designer, but you want to show off some of your skills.
Awesome. As you've kind of seen a bunch of different conversation designers take a stab at what a voice experience looks like, what are some of the top 3 mistakes that companies make when they start with voice applications?
I think one of the top ones is you assume anyone using your system really knows what it's going to do, because we're so deep into whatever we're building, and so you have this very like open-ended, like, hey everybody, here's my action or my chatbot or whatever, how can I help you? And it's like, I have no idea you can help me. What can you do? And your user quickly falls off this cliff where they've typed or said something that you just can't handle. So I think people love the idea of having these like super conversational, open-ended stuff, and that's great and all, but most companies can't actually build that. So it's okay to have a fairly directed thing, like, welcome to, Cathy's trivia game. Do you want to play easy or hard? Or, a very direct question that's like, get the user to have a successful interaction right off the bat with a simpler question, before you kind of throw them into like, here's all the things you can do. So I think being too open-ended and not explanatory enough is one thing. Another huge thing I still see in 2020 is just really poor air handling. Because again, you got to know that people are going to say or type things that you did not plan for. It is just going to happen. And if you just go with your default, like, I didn't understand, please say your command again, you're doomed. So really investing in that is something I still see people not doing. And then finally, I think one thing I also still see is people write a prompt and they think, okay, I've asked the person for this question. They're obviously going to answer with something related, a direct answer. And people often don't. And designers or the builders think, what's wrong with these users? I told them what to say and they didn't say it. Come to terms, accept that humans don't just reply exactly the way you want, but they're not going to say something bizarre out of the blue. Like if you say, how many people in your reservation, they're not going to say, how tall is Barack Obama? But they might say, do you have outdoor seating? Perfectly legitimate question. And you should be able to handle sort of those domain specific things that people say.
Awesome. A big topic that comes up in voice is discoverability and what will eventually become of voice SEO. What type of advice do you have, or is there a formula right now that you know of that can help with discoverability in voice?
I agree. This is one of the biggest challenges out there. It's really, really, really tough. And I don't think there's going to be a short-term solution to this. I think in terms of, there's different types of discoverability. There's discoverability about what can be done within your own experience, like within your own chatbot or within your own action or skill or whatever. And for that, there's some different strategies you can take, where we have this idea of the just-in-time help, where you don't, for example, overwhelm your user with the 15 things you can do right out of the gate, because they won't remember, because it's not relevant to them at that time. But instead, you look for, like, if they do something that's related to another feature you have, if they complete that first task successfully, you might throw in a, like, well, by the way, you can also do related thing. And that's a better time for their brain to kind of absorb it. But it's this huge problem right now, because there's thousands of things these voice assistants can do, and who knows what they are. And to get past that, we're going to have to get to the point where people can really say things in a huge variety of ways and still get to where they're going, and not have to know, like, keywords to get somewhere. And that's slowly evolving, but I think, to me, that's kind of the area where this technology is kind of the most behind.
Nice. Another question from a master's student at CMU. He says, my team's currently working on a voice interface, and they're working on a program that's for the underserved. One of the challenges that they're facing is creating an interaction that conveys empathy. What are your thoughts on creating voice interfaces that convey empathy or are able to convey different types of emotion?
That's it's great that you're thinking about that. That is certainly very challenging, because you really have to walk that line where, sometimes you can say something and it it can anger people, because it's like, that's fake. You're not really sorry that I feel bad today, or whatever. So you have to carefully walk that line where, like, when I worked at a company on a health, virtual nurse avatar, and we were in sensitive situations, one thing we found is that, it's easier to show the empathy and the emotion in positive areas. Like, if they did really well on a particular health thing that week, you might say, great job. Um, and people were usually like, yeah, yeah, good, that's nice that it says that. Whereas if, again, if you said something like, I'm really sorry that you're feeling bad, a lot of people would be like, no, you're not, you're a bot, or whatever. um, but on the other hand, sometimes what people can still make people feel better is acknowledgement. We know this about people. When someone is telling you about this difficult interaction they had with their boss, they don't want you to say, like, well, here's what you should have done, or, things like that. They want you to say, like, oh, sounds like a hard day. And that's a much, I think, better line to walk, because what you're doing is you're just basically validating what they said. You're not making a judgment. You're not saying how you feel about it. You're just saying, that's what happened to you. I'm here and I heard you. And that is powerful. And even when a bot does it, it can be powerful. So I think that's a little bit of a safer way to acknowledge a difficult situation or something without putting a judgment that the bot is having about it.
Awesome. Next question is from Nicole Merrill asking, what role do you see UX playing in conversation AI? And with respect to that, there's a ton of questions on just other roles that already exist in other teams. How do they play in with the conversation design workflow?
So I'm assuming by UX, you're saying like a visual designer or an interaction designer, or other folks like that who are working together with a conversation designer. Um, and in that case, that's a great question, because that's something that's so relevant today. And the best teams, I think, and this is hard, but the best teams, I think, try to come up with collaborative tools and processes to help them work together. Because if you just say, well, okay, here's the voice designers are going to do this and throw it over the wall, and now the visual designers are going to do this and throw it over the wall, you really, there's a disconnect there. So that it's best if you can bring all the designers together early on, together, to talk about the use cases and to go through the sample dialogues, so everyone has an idea of what the conversation flow is going to be like. And then ideally, you'll have a tool where you can share assets and, have both the prompts and, say, the cards or whatever the visual assets are, together, so that even if maybe one person is working on the visual assets and one person on the prompts, they can still see what they look like when they come together, and both sides will notice problems that might come up, like, that prompt does not go with what I created here in this asset, or vice versa. So tools and process, again, not easy at all, but just knowing that, working together early on, is going to help save pain later.
What is the shortest answer you've given to the question, so what exactly is your job?
I should really have a better answer to this. My shortest answer is not very short, which is, I usually try to ground it and say, have you ever interacted with Siri or Alexa or the Google Assistant? I work on making those conversations better.
I mean, that's still pretty short. So that's still good. Another question that we have in here right now, I'm going to kind of combine two. What are some of the biggest unsolved problems that you see in conversation design right now? And are there any things that you imagine in the next few years that voice might be able to solve that it currently isn't?
So I think again, discoverability is going to be my number one. I think my number two is, I talk a lot about like, hey, you've got to have great air handling, but let's be honest, that is a big time sink for designers and developers. There's a reason that people often reuse generic ones because it takes time, it takes effort. I think there may be some strides, hopefully soon, where maybe what can be done is that maybe there could be like a more auto-generated first pass at these more context-specific error handling prompts, and then a human maybe could just go back and review as opposed to having to handcraft them all. So I think hopefully in the near future we'll move towards a sort of a hybrid model where maybe portions of your design are auto-generated, and then again, you're still going to need a human reviewer most of the time at this point to help with that. So those are a couple things. I'm trying to remember what the end of the the end of the question was.
The end of the question was, are there any things in the next few years that you think voice will be able to solve that it currently isn't
Mm.
today?
So I guess say those are the things I hope it would be able to solve some more, because right now it's just expensive and time consuming to create new experiences, because you do need like a conversation designer to design, and you need a developer who has the time and resources to create those designs. And it's just not super scalable. So a small company comes in and they want to build a really awesome voice experience, and they don't have a conversation designer. What do they do? And so it makes it hard to make it. There's no kind of WordPress type thing yet. I mean, I know that tools like Voiceflow and stuff are really striving to make that happen, but it still takes a skill set to think and craft the design.
The next question that's come up is around voice commerce. So we've spoken and we've seen a lot of interest around people being able to purchase using their voice, or people being able to incorporate commerce into their designs. Do you think that this will become more and more of a popular topic? And is there anyone that's doing that really well right now?
This is definitely not my area of expertise. So I would say that I think we do have to come to a model for how conversational experiences can tie into, revenue and things like that. Um, I think we're still very much in the early experimental stages of that, and that I'm not sure anyone has figured it out. Certainly, I know there are skills and actions like rain sounds and stuff, that do end up being able to make money, but I think it's just such a new paradigm that we haven't figured it out yet. And thinking about something like if you're a brand, what does it mean to put your brand on voice? Maybe putting your brand on voice isn't necessarily like something that leads to a purchase, for example. Like let's say you sell shoes. Maybe your voice experience isn't to buy shoes because that's kind of a hard thing to do over voice only. Maybe instead you have this fun branded experience about your brand and shoes that someone does with voice that's fun, that gets their mind thinking like, oh, now I want to go buy those shoes. I'm going to go on the website and buy them or something like that. So I just think there's like ways that no one has really come up with yet to kind of fold in these experiences to the greater ecosystem of commerce. But yeah, I would not call myself an expert on that at all.
That's totally okay. This I feel like you definitely are an expert in. The next question is, you've obviously tested out and you've seen a ton of actions being developed on Google. What are some of your favorites or some of the top actions that have really done well in terms of conversational design?
Um, that's a. I also feel like in a way that's a bit of a loaded question because I know whatever I leave out, people are like, "What about this one?" Um, but for me, things like the wait, don't tell me quiz, I think is pretty neat because one of the reasons I think it's so good is because it uses the real voice actor, the real people on the show to voice it, which it can be more expensive than using TTS, but to me that adds so much to it to make it a more compelling experience. So certainly, I think games and things have made some interesting strides. if I look at my own usage of my Google Assistant, however, my primary things are like the standard alarms and music, but I use it for answers all the time, every single day. Like last night, I was reading, and I just started asking questions about stuff I'm reading, because I don't want to get out my phone or anything, and I just find that absolutely invaluable. So I love those kind of things. We were also playing the game Hey Robot, maybe some of you have heard of, which is super fun, where it's a bunch of cards with words on them, and you have to get your voice assistant to say the word on the card, like vampire or muffin. Oh my gosh, it was impossible to get it to say muffin. You'd be really surprised at how challenging it is, but it helps you learn a lot about what these voice assistants can do. So if you haven't heard of it, check out Hey Robot, really fun game.
Awesome. The next question is from a graduate from cognitive science and linguistics. They just said, I've started to dive into conversation design, and I just finished my first project, and I'm at the user testing phase. Aside from observation, I was wondering if you had any tips to help gauge whether users are succeeding or struggling.
Yeah, I mean, most of the measurements I think to apply there are there's task completion. So if they have to do a particular thing, whether it's playing a game, having a conversation, doing a bank transaction, whatever your markers are for, like, okay, they successfully completed level one, or they successfully transferred money from A to B. Obviously, task completion is a really important aspect. Other than that, you're looking at, like, what is the no match rate? How many times did they say or type something that it didn't handle? No input. How many times did it appear that they said nothing or typed nothing given the question? Sometimes retention is important. User testing is a little different, so it's harder to measure. But if you want something that people will come back to, you want to find a way to say, like, to be able to ask that, or allow them to come back. So those are the few things. There's also, like, qualitatively, there is the difference between yes, I succeeded, and yes, that was a pleasant experience. So it may be that they successfully transferred money from A to B, but boy, they hated it, it was really painful. That's important information. So task completion alone is not necessarily all you need.
Awesome. The next question is, how has turn taking best practices changed between IVRs to voice assistants, given that voice assistants leverage wake words and also have visual cues? Do you recommend any resources to understand the latest and greatest on this space?
Gosh, I don't think I have any turn-taking resources specifically, except some of those books I talked about that are on my FAQ page at cathypearl.com, that talk about human communication and turn-taking, that are fascinating. That talk about things like, if I ask you a question like, "Can you give me a ride tomorrow?" and more than a second goes by, you're not going to answer me. You probably don't want to give me a ride. So things like how long people pause between turns impacts voice assistants as well, because if there's a latency in your voice assistant and they haven't responded, your lizard brain is thinking, like, oh, the answer is going to be no, or they don't, something's wrong here. Um, but one thing I will say about turn taking that I think is different between IVRs and things with visual, like when I worked at that company with the virtual nurse avatar, one thing we discovered, actually even before that, another company with recorded humans, is that if you're looking at a face and there's a no match error, so the face asks you a question, you say something it doesn't understand. We found by accident, honestly, that if the face doesn't say anything but just kind of keeps looking, you automatically realize, as you would with the person, like, oh, they didn't understand me, and most people repeat themselves. And so with the visual cues, sometimes like a face or eyes, it's enough that you don't have to actually explicitly say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand you, please say that again, whatever. You just know it and you repeat yourself, and like 80% of the time in that case, people would successfully move on. So there's some interesting aspects about the visual that make it so you don't have to be maybe as explicit about your no match. Another thing I think that's evolved a bit is we try to do sometimes very short reprompts. So if you're like, would you like this or that, and the person says something, instead of repeating the whole thing and I'm sorry I didn't understand and blah blah blah, just be like, oh, was that milk or dark chocolate, and get back on track quickly.
The next question, and I'm sure you have a ton of ideas around this, but how do you see the role of conversation designer evolving as the field starts to mature?
I think, and I'm obviously biased, but I think that conversation designers tend to often have good systems thinking, and by that I mean they're often not just thinking about that individual prompt, but they're thinking about like, how does this tie into the end to end? Like, where is the user? Are they in the kitchen chopping vegetables? Are they in the car? Are they on a walk? That's the mindset that they're in. What's going to happen at the end when they get this information? And I tend, and again, I'm biased, but I tend to see that a little more in conversation designers sometimes than say as a traditional visual designer. And I think we should lean into that strength and become sort of leads on projects. So a project might have multiple designers, but maybe the conversation designer can also play the role sometimes of like the overarching, like I'm going to make sure all the pieces are fitting together and that the whole flow works well together. And so I'd like to think that we can build that as a strength.
Awesome. The next question's around validation. So, as you're building, how do you validate if the final product, whether it's bot or voice, has reached your goals after IT programming teams have done their job? Do you use a tool or is there a methodology for that?
Um, Certainly, like at Google, we have our own sort of in-house tools, but there's other companies out there like Dashbot who can help do that type of measurement. But I think that the most important thing is to define your goals in the beginning and not add them on at the end after you've already launched, because it's you can we're all just sort of naturally biased to think about things differently post launch than we are before we even get started in to our favor, to think of goals that are in our favor. So number one, establish them early on. But number two, again, you have to think about your use case. For example, retention for certain things like a game might make a lot of sense, and if your users aren't coming back, that's bad. But you might build something where honestly they use it once every 6 months, and that is completely fine. So you have to set that correctly. Also, sometimes I see people go down the path of looking at length of conversation, like, oh, if they had a long conversation, that means we were successful. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. It's only one aspect of it. Again, looking at no match rates. Where are the places where we're failing the user the most? You look at a funnel of dropouts. How far do people usually get before they drop out, and what's going on there? Why are they dropping out? Is that okay? Are we missing something? And then again, if you can do qualitative and actually talk to people who've used it and say, what went well for you? Were there any challenges? Things like that, to find out not only could they be successful, but was it a good experience as well?
Great. And I think we only have time for one more question. This one I've seen so many tweets about since COVID, and I know that you have a kid at home too, so I'm curious to hear your take. But how do you feel about kids interacting with voice experience interfaces compared to adults? Are there anything that's exciting or anything that stands out to you?
Yeah, so my son is 12 now, but we've had smart speakers in the house for years, and it's been interesting watching him evolve with them. I think they're great for kids. I know there's people have different opinions, but um, wow, there's a few reasons for that. One is watching my own son. I was shocked at how many things he would try that didn't even occur to me. I'm an expert in this field, and he would be like, I'm going to try this. I'll be like, that's not going to work, or whatever. And it would, or whatever. And he was just really open to exploration, just trying whatever. And I think that's an awesome thing. And kids are more likely to have that than adults. The other thing is it can give a kid a little more uh, influence in the house. So, for example, when I was a kid, I had a boombox and I listened to the radio and I taped stuff off the radio, and that was my music. We don't have that, and a lot of households don't have that anymore. So the only music he could choose was what I or my husband chose. And once he was able to speak to the smart speaker and choose his own music, it opened up music to him in a way that wasn't there before. And I loved to see that. Now that he's 12 and he's doing school at home, he uses the Google Mini in the dining room for setting alarms to remind him of things, asking homework questions. Uses it a lot. So the whole family uses it, and I think it's pretty neat to watch kids and see how they interact.
Yeah, I think that we've seen so many like adorable videos ranging from like 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds who are just like asking the same question over and over and over again to
Yeah.
parents playing games with them, for them even just occupying some time when you need a breather and you're locked at home. It's really exciting to see that like genuine magical moment for kids who are experiencing an interface without the bias of what we have today.
Yeah, and one other aspect I like about it is the screenless nature of a smart speaker. Like I often talk about at dinner, you know, we don't have devices, but we have questions, and now we can just ask the voice assistant, and it joins the conversation, and it's not me like, okay, one sec, I'm just like lost in my phone forever. So I like that too. Yeah, so I think it's, you know, I've maybe heard a little bit too much Perry Grip and Weird Al at this point because he likes to listen to the same songs over and over. But overall, for us, it's been a real positive experience.
Awesome. Well, I just want to say, like, thank you so much, Cathy. This has been really, really great. Is there any kind of like parting wisdom that you have before we wrap things up beyond everything?
um, I don't think so. Like I said earlier, I just think it's a great time to be a conversation designer, even in this weird time in the world we're in. I think there's so much opportunity out there, and so many companies and people are realizing the importance of this role. There's more opportunities than ever. So, you know, go out there and build stuff.
Awesome. So, just so that you guys know, there are so many more events and opportunities like this. I really want to thank Cathy for all her time. It is awesome to have somebody with your type of experience on taking the time to share your wisdom with us. If you're curious, our entire month, next month, is around professional conversation designers. So, we're going to be kicking it off with Celine from 24/7 AI, followed by Jed, who's a learning program manager at Amazon. We also have an AMA with Braden, who is the CEO of Voiceflow, coming up next week. So definitely check out those events if you're curious how other people in the industry have learned or have taken off in the last few years as well. And don't forget to join in on our global community. We'd love to hear feedback on what are some of the things that you learned today, what are things that you want to learn, so we can continue to bring on more people like Cathy to be able to answer these amazing questions that you guys have. And last but not least, thank you so much for everyone for spending your hour with us. Please stay tuned. We'll be following up with all the amazing resources that Cathy dropped today, as well as a recording of the session for you guys to check out. And definitely stay tuned for more. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a lot of fun.